you to buy books on poetry, so
Mm.
that's when you know you're old. But no, my Irishness is very, very much here now. And as I say, I'm totally proud of what the country has done. I'm worried, as I am, about the whole world, because the whole world seems to have this sort of internationalism that was the flavor some years ago, that said, look, it's one world, we're all together, we help each other. And now with idiots like Trump and Netanyahu and some of these people, the world has just turned into this cruel, cruel, selfish place. And I look at some of the things that have happened in Ireland, as in South Africa, with absolute fear and disgust. And you just hope that somebody, whether it's Nelson Mandela, can stand up and just say, hang on, guys, let's take a stock of ourselves and let's look at ourselves as people, not as selfish nationalists. So yeah, I'm worried at the moment, and certainly certain things I see in Ireland. I mean, to see burning buses and riots in the middle of Dublin,
Yeah.
and also to see people terrified to walk down O'Connell Street at night. Now I know that's probably just the bad news stories that have come through, just like crime in South Africa often affects people. But looking at it from a distance, there are certain aspects that worry me.
Yeah, and news travels in a funny way now. There's always the bad news, and sometimes it's prone to exaggeration, but it doesn't change the overall perspective. I mean,
It's exactly, well, it doesn't. If you think about it, that perception is reality when
correct,
you're booking an airline ticket.
correct,
Let's
correct.
put it that way.
And the world is a more aggressive place than it was 10 years, 20 years ago. I
Indeed,
mean, I was
indeed.
in Boston when Mandela was freed, and the world was in a bad place, we thought, but it was unimaginable that he'd walk out one day out of Robben Island and do what he did. So
Abs-
you got to be hopeful and positive that there's something else around the corner that we're not expecting.
Well, people don't realize, I think, now that, I mean, it's extraordinary now. I did my Mandela impersonation and told you my Mandela story. You talk to people who are not even youngsters now. You talk to people who are close to middle age, and they look at you and say, "You spoke to Nelson Mandela."
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
like, my God, something has rubbed off on you. But people forget that South Africa was on the verge. It was literally on a knife edge. South Africa, every time you look at the obscenity of Gaza, the obscenity of Ukraine, the obscenity of Sudan, which of course nobody cares about because it's tucked away in Africa, that could have been South Africa.
yeah.
And in fact, if it was in South Africa, it would have been a hell of a lot worse than that. It could have been as bad as that. And luckily, Nelson Mandela came out of jail. Uh, Everyone thought a right-wing sort of conservative leader called F.W. de Klerk realized
Yeah.
that there was one chance, one moment of a window of opportunity for South Africa. And somehow those two managed to get on with a lot of ups and downs along the way. And for all the problems South Africa does, and it does, and the government has been a huge, huge disappointment over the last decade in particular. And yes, there's crime, and yes, there's all sorts of issues. But you look at the world, South Africa is one of the great success stories where it negotiated itself away from a civil war. And sadly, it should be doing so much better. But I'm still optimistic that sanity will prevail.
Yeah, I was on there once, I think it was 93, stayed in Rosebank in Joburg, and was scared to say if you couldn't do this, you couldn't do that. So it's amazing to see how the country, and Rosebank was a safe place, you know what I mean? The hotel there.
I know Rosebank very, very
Yeah,
well
it
indeed.
probably
And
changed now, John, but we went with the psychosis of the place was dangerous. Don't do this and don't do that. Yeah,
I know what you're saying, and yet I would willingly walk. I've lived here
yeah,
for
yeah,
45
exactly.
years and never had a violent criminal act at all. But I'll tell you a funny story, and it goes back to what we talked about perceptions, Rossa. When I was sort of driving our early morning show, you could do an outside broadcast as long as there was a reason for it. So, for example, at a World Cup, we'd go to UK, we went to Australia, we went to New Zealand. When the Laureus World Sports Awards were in St. Petersburg, we went to St. Petersburg, we went to France, so as long as there was a reason for it. And then this headline came up that the GDP of Nigeria had just overtaken South Africa as the biggest in Africa. Now, I'm not sure if it was true enough, but I jumped in on this and said, we've got to go to Lagos. And so we went to Lagos, and everyone says, what? Lagos, Nigeria? Oh, my God, they'll cut your throat to rub your shoes. My wife wouldn't let me bring my nice watch and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, we got to Lagos, the nicest people I've ever met, ever, ever, ever. They were just so fantastic. There were lots of problems with the country. But the thing I remember was all these Nigerians saying to me, you live in Johannesburg. How can you live in
Yeah.
Johannesburg? So they are perceptions, I suppose. But as I say, if you're booking a ticket, perceptions are reality.
Yeah, I'm just back from 10 days in Colombia, and I wouldn't have gone for that fear. And I've never been to a nicer place in Cartagena in my life. So there you go. You have to book the ticket. When we look at the toughest moments of your life, John, where you've had to be really resilient, what comes to mind? Or have you had bad, tough moments?
Oh, yeah. Well, my little brother died last year of cancer, horrible cancer, and Peter Robbie, and I miss him terribly. And he went on the radio, the Joe Duffy show, and he phoned up and said, I want to talk. And he got cancer of his urethra. Now, can you imagine anything worse? He lost the lot without being indelicate. Was never down, never bad mood, nothing. And he insisted on phoning Joe Duffy's show to talk it through, boots and all, no holding anything back, just to warn people about symptoms and about getting checked and everything. And I can't believe, tell you the number of people who got in touch with me, people who didn't even know who it was until the end. And realized it was my little brother, Peter Robbie, and just to say how incredible. And he died a horrible, horrible death last year. So that was big, and losing my dad to cancer early, so death. But I mean, death is part of life. I think being involved in that whole shit show over South Africa was terrible because I knew, and you could always justify it. You could always say no politics in sport. You can always say keep sport away from this. What does it matter when businesses are doing
it's impossible
business,
to
when
separate,
governments? There's so much hypocrisy. So why should sport people suffer? But if I'm honest, and even to myself, then I knew one day I would regret it. I knew one day I would regret making a selfish decision. Not going once. You can always say I wanted to go once. And, I think of my dear friend Tony Ward, who went on the Lions tour and then bravely said he's not going with Ireland. Donald Spring, a lot of other guys did the same. And especially Hugo McNeil, who at that stage was just breaking in to the Irish team as a youngster and, risked his sort of running foul of selectors and so on by not going. But I think in the middle of that shitstorm, it was horrible. It was horrible. And, to have people pointing at you and people, I won't figuratively spitting at you. And I think being disappointed was the point. And I look back and I'm massively disappointed in myself because here was an ethical decision. And I went against what I knew was right. And that hurts me. And in a funny way, you can actually compare it with when I was on radio here, things got very, very tense.
I was going to say,
and I had some death threats against me. And there was one of the worst apartheid assassins in South Africa, a guy by the name of Eugene de Kock, who came out of jail about 2 years ago. He was known as Prime Evil. He served 20 years in jail. And he told me that he was told to shoot me, to assassinate me. And there were other things to be shot. And, and
but you did have protection for a while, didn't you? And bodyguards, didn't you?
Yeah, no, not at all. Not at all. There'd be occasionally after a threat, because I don't think people realize quite how serious it was till afterwards. But my point is this. I look at that where I should have been more worried about it. And my family and my kids suffered at school with, kids can be cruel and comments about your dad and my wife and things like that. And yet at that time, I wore those like a badge of honor. It was cathartic. I was standing up for what I knew was right. And in a funny sort of a way, I think because, I was much more politically aware, but I'm not making that as an excuse. I was still wrong to tour South Africa. But in a funny sort of a way, I found that almost cathartic, that here I could take a brave, unselfish decision. I could put myself out there and stand up and be counted.
Yeah.
Whereas I didn't those years ago in the rugby. So again, to go back to my sort of theme or my view of my life as chapters, those were sort of different chapters. And sometimes I look back on it now, terrified. When you look at and I remember Eugene de Kock speaking to him. And I said to him, because the police told him, to assassinate me with a crossbow. Can you imagine that?
Wow.
I was to be shot with a hunting crossbow in order to send a message to people who are having a go at the apartheid regime. And I